Episode number 53. And Kay would certainly not have noticed this little pulpit, if there had not been a lamp fastened above it, which usually meant there was a sermon about to be given. So was a sermon to be given now? In this empty church? Kay looked down at the steps which, pressed close against the column, led up to the pulpit. They were so narrow they seemed to be there as decoration on the column rather than for anyone to use. But under the pulpit, Kay grinned in astonishment. There really was a priest standing with his hand on the handrail ready to climb the steps, and looking at Kay. Then he nodded very slightly, so that Kay crossed himself, and genuflected as he should have done earlier. With a little swing, the priest went up into the pulpit with short fast steps. Was there really a sermon about to begin? Maybe the man in the cassock had not been really so demented, and had meant to lead K.'s way to the preacher, which in this empty church would have been very necessary. And there was also, somewhere in front of a picture of the Virgin Mary, an old woman, who should have come to hear the sermon. And if there was a sermon, why had it not been introduced on the organ? But the organ remained quiet, and merely looked out weakly from the darkness of its great height. Kay now considered whether he should leave as quickly as possible. If he did not do it now, there would be no chance of doing so during the sermon, and he would have to stay there for as long as it lasted. He had lost so much time when he should have been in his office. There had long been no need for him to wait for the Italian any longer. He looked at his watch. It was 11. But could there really be a sermon given? Could Kay constitute the entire congregation? How could he when he was just a stranger, who wanted to look at the church? That, basically, was all he was. The idea of a sermon, now, at 11 o'clock, on a workday, in hideous weather, was nonsense. The priest, there was no doubt that he was a priest, a young man with a smooth, dark face, was clearly going up there just to put the lamp out after somebody had lit it by mistake. But there had been no mistake. The priest seemed rather to check that the lamp was lit, and turned it a little higher. Then he slowly turned to face the front, and leant down on the balustrade, gripping its angular rail with both hands. He stood there like that for a while and, without turning his head, looked around. Kay had moved back a long way and leant his elbows on the front pew. Somewhere in the church, he could not have said exactly where, he could make out the man in the cassock hunched under his bent back, and at peace, as if his work were completed. In the cathedral it was now very quiet. But Kay would have to disturb that silence. He had no intention of staying there. If it was the priest's duty to preach at a certain time, regardless of the circumstances, then he could, and he could do it without K.'s taking part, and K.'s presence would do nothing to augment the effect of it. So Kay began slowly to move, felt his way on tiptoe along the pew, arrived at the broad aisle, and went along it without being disturbed, except for the sound of his steps, however light, which rang out on the stone floor, and resounded from the vaulting, quiet but continuous at a repeating, regular pace. Kay felt slightly abandoned as, probably observed by the priest, he walked by himself between them pews, and the size of the cathedral seemed to just at the limit of what a man could bear. When he arrived back at where he had been sitting, he did not hesitate, but simply reached out for the album he had left there, and took it with him. He had nearly left the area covered by pews, and was close to the empty space between himself and the exit when, for the first time, he heard the voice of the priest. A powerful and experienced voice. It pierced through the reaches of the cathedral, waiting for it. But the priest was not calling out to the congregation. His cry was quite unambiguous, and there was no escape from it. He called, "Joseph K."